The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting a soft twilight over the city of Washington, D.C. In the distance, the Potomac River glistened faintly, its surface calm and slow, mirroring the mood of a capital that never truly slept. Along the National Mall, the final footsteps of government workers faded into silence, and a hush settled over the vast marble monuments that watched over the city. But beyond those monuments, beyond the grand dome of the Capitol and the solemn stone of the Lincoln Memorial, there stood a structure shaped like no other, the Pentagon. Massive, efficient, and unadorned, it loomed not with majesty, but with intent. It was a symbol of calculated power, a place where decisions of great consequence were made not in fury, but in silence. Inside that five-sided labyrinth, the air was cold and dry, humming with the soft electric buzz of fluorescent lights and distant ventilation. The polished corridors stretched endlessly, indistinguishable in their geometry, broken only by security doors and muted voices behind glass. In one of the more secluded rooms, far from windows and far from curious ears, 5 men sat around a long table. Each wore a uniform adorned with brass and ribbons, symbols of wars past and honors earned. But their posture was still, their gazes distant. These were the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking officers of the United States military. And tonight, they were not speaking of tanks or troops or ships at sea. Tonight, they were speaking of Cuba. Only 90 miles from the shores of Florida, Cuba had once been viewed by Americans as a sunny escape, rich in sugar and rum, music and palm trees. Tourists from the mainland filled its casinos and cafes, while American businesses profited from its fertile lands. But that world had changed. In 1959, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro overthrew the corrupt regime of Fulgencio Batista. With his scruffy beard and piercing eyes, Castro had captured the spirit of rebellion. And once in power, he turned sharply toward the Soviet Union. To Washington, it was not merely a loss of influence, it was a threat. A communist state had taken root just offshore, and worse still, it had the backing of Moscow. In the years that followed, diplomatic tensions gave way to action. The CIA launched covert operations to undermine Castro's rule, and in 1961, the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion, a plan to overthrow the Cuban government with US-backed exiles, ended in disaster. The failure was not just military, it was political and personal. President John F. Kennedy, young and newly elected, carried the weight of that embarrassment on his shoulders. The military, eager to correct the mistake, grew impatient. The public, wary of further conflict, remained hesitant. And so, as conventional options failed, the unconventional began to emerge. At first, it was only whispers, a passing suggestion, a what if. A file quietly passed from one hand to another. A thought floated in a meeting, dismissed at first, but not forgotten. What if the United States could justify direct military action? What if it appeared that Cuba had struck first? Would the American people support a war if they believed they were defending themselves? And most importantly, what if that provocation didn't come from Cuba at all? Slowly, the idea evolved. It became a proposal, a draft, a secret memorandum. Operation Northwoods. The plan was bold, unthinkable, and yet meticulously structured. It included suggestions to stage fake terrorist attacks on American soil, hijackings of civilian aircraft, and even the sinking of a US ship, all to be blamed on the Cuban regime. The objective was not destruction for its own sake, but manipulation. To create a narrative, to manufacture consent. For the men at the table, it was not a question of morality, it was strategy. In their eyes, the end justified the means. After all, they reasoned, the Soviet threat was real, and Cuba was its outpost. If a lie could protect the homeland, was it not worth considering? They convinced themselves it was only a contingency, something to have in reserve. But somewhere in the quiet ticking of the clock, the line between planning and intention began to blur. The lights above flickered faintly as one of the officers leaned back in his chair, hands folded, eyes narrowed. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The plan was written, signed, and filed. And though it would never be approved, though history would later cast it as a dark curiosity of Cold War desperation, in that moment, deep within the Pentagon, it was very real. Outside, the city exhaled slowly into the spring night. Inside, the silence of concrete and paper concealed a secret, one that would not come to light for more than 3 decades. And even then, it would sound like fiction. But it was not fiction. It was Operation Northwoods. Before the whispers in the Pentagon, before false flags and hidden memos, there was Cuba. A jewel in the Caribbean, vibrant and restless, suspended between wealth and poverty, between colonial echoes and the promise of revolution. To American visitors in the 1950s, Cuba was a place of charm and indulgence. Havana's streets filled with bright convertibles, jazz drifting from open bars, and the clatter of dice in smoky casinos. But behind the colorful facades and tourist smiles, a darker truth festered. Power in those years belonged to Fulgencio Batista. Batista had once been hailed as a reformer. Rising through the military ranks, he positioned himself as a man of the people, until the mask fell. By the mid-1950s, his rule had curdled into authoritarianism. Elections were manipulated. Opposition voices were silenced. American businesses, while thriving under Batista's policies, turned a blind eye to the growing inequality. For the rural poor, for the students and workers, for the young men with ideals and nothing to lose, Cuba had become a nation suffocating beneath corruption. And then came the mountains. In 1956, a small group of rebels, barely more than 20, landed on the southeastern coast of Cuba aboard a yacht named Grandma. Among them was a man with intense eyes, a tangle of dark hair, and the charisma of a prophet, Fidel Castro. He was 30 years old, a former law student turned revolutionary, who had once tried to take power by force and failed. This time, he would do things differently. Retreating into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, Castro and his ragged band began a campaign of guerrilla warfare. Short, strategic, precise. The rebels were poor, often hungry, and vastly outnumbered. But they had something Batista's army lacked: belief. They spoke of justice, of dignity, of a Cuba not sold to foreign corporations but shaped by its own people. They taught peasants to read, handed out medicine, and moved like shadows through the hills. Bit by bit, they became legends. As word of their victories spread, Batista's grip weakened. Cities erupted in protest. Even those who had once supported him began to falter. American diplomats, watching from embassy windows, reported growing instability. But few truly believed the rebels would succeed. They underestimated the power of desperation. And they underestimated Castro. On January 1st, 1959, Batista fled Cuba. The dictator boarded a plane in the dead of night, taking with him suitcases stuffed with money and leaving behind a country on the edge of change. That morning, as the sun rose over Havana, Fidel Castro's forces entered the capital to the sound of celebration. Crowds filled the streets, flags waved, and for the first time in years, hope filled the air like perfume. But revolutions are rarely tidy. At first, Castro denied any allegiance to communism. He promised fair elections, economic reform, and national pride. He met with foreign leaders, gave long, passionate speeches, and allowed journalists to film his every move. He was magnetic, unpredictable, and utterly captivating. The world watched and waited. And then the tone shifted. Land was seized from wealthy landowners and foreign corporations. Businesses were nationalized. Opposition parties were suppressed. Trials were held in public stadiums. And soon, the Soviet Union appeared, not as a shadowy benefactor, but as a partner. Khrushchev sent oil. Advisors followed. The Red Star quietly found its place alongside the Cuban flag. In Washington, The optimism that had briefly flickered now burned with anxiety. What had once been a playground for American tourists was now a front line of Cold War tension. A communist state, aligned with the USSR, had taken root less than 100 miles from Miami. To the Pentagon, this was not just about Cuba. It was about the world. If revolution could take hold there, where might it spread next? Latin America? Africa? Even within the United States? The rise of Castro was more than a political upheaval. It was a symbolic blow. The old order had crumbled, and in its place stood a man in olive green fatigues, shaking hands with Moscow and smiling at the cameras. And thus the stage was set. The fall of Batista was complete. The revolution had succeeded. But in its wake came fear, secrecy, and a question that haunted Washington's most powerful minds. What do you do when your enemy is close, but untouchable? That question would linger like smoke in the corridors of power, until one day, someone answered it, not with diplomacy or war, but with illusion. In the months following the revolution, the world watched Cuba with bated breath. At first, there was hope that perhaps this new government, though radical, might still find common ground with the West. Perhaps Fidel Castro, with his fiery speeches and unpredictable charm, was simply a nationalist, a reformer, someone driven more by pride than ideology. After all, he had denied being a communist, and his early policies, though aggressive, were still couched in language that hinted at compromise. But compromise is fragile in the age of fear. In Washington, trust is not given, it is calculated. And as Castro's reforms accelerated, that calculation shifted. American-owned oil refineries were seized without compensation. Sugar plantations, once profitable centers of foreign wealth, were nationalized. American diplomats were stonewalled. And in Havana's new order, the rhetoric turned colder. Words like imperialism and exploitation found their way into every broadcast, every newspaper, every speech. What began as suspicion turned into certainty. The United States no longer saw Cuba as merely unpredictable. It now saw a threat. By 1960, Cuba had formally established diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union. Khrushchev embraced the Cuban Revolution as a symbol of global resistance to the capitalist West. Soviet technicians arrived to assist with infrastructure. Shipments of crude oil, wheat, and machinery flowed into Cuban ports. And in return, Cuba became a beachhead for Moscow's ideology in the Western Hemisphere. For the United States, it was an insult that struck close to the bone. This was not some distant province of Eastern Europe. This was not the other side of the world. This was the Caribbean. This was America's backyard. The fear was not just military. It was psychological. If Cuba, a country so close and so deeply enmeshed with American commerce and culture, could fall to communism, what else might follow? Could Venezuela be next? Could Guatemala, already unstable, tip further left? Could the flame of revolution sweep the hemisphere? In the press, Cuba became a daily headline. Words like betrayal, danger, and enemy regime appeared beside photographs of Castro waving triumphantly, cigarette in hand, army cap tilted back. For the average American, the cheerful vacation island of the 1950s was gone. In its place stood a defiant, foreign, and increasingly militarized state, hostile to everything the United States claimed to stand for. Within the Pentagon and the CIA, planning began to shift. At first, covert sabotage. Agents infiltrated the island to disrupt transportation, poison crops, spread misinformation. Ships were sunk quietly, radio signals jammed, factories disabled. But Castro remained, defiant and unshaken. He gave speeches that lasted hours, mocking the efforts against him, calling out the hypocrisy of the great American empire. Then came the Bay of Pigs. In April 1961, a force of Cuban exiles trained and armed by the CIA landed at Playa Girón, hoping to ignite a counter-revolution. But the plan was flawed, the assumptions misguided. Castro's forces responded swiftly. The invasion collapsed in less than 3 days. It was a humiliation, not just for the exiles, but for the Kennedy administration. The world saw through the denials. It was clear who had orchestrated the assault. And in Havana, Castro emerged not weakened, but strengthened, his power consolidated by a narrative of resistance and survival. That failure was a turning point. From that moment on, the United States no longer viewed Cuba as merely problematic. It was an enemy, an extension of Soviet influence, a platform for propaganda, a potential staging ground for nuclear missiles. And the question no longer was if something had to be done, but how. The political mood in Washington darkened. Patience ran thin. Voices within the military and intelligence communities grew louder. They called for stronger action, more drastic solutions. Some demanded an outright invasion. Others, a surgical strike. But one group, quietly, carefully, began drafting something different. Not an attack, not a war, an illusion. If the American people could not yet be convinced to support another military campaign, perhaps they could be persuaded, and thus the seeds were planted. Operation Northwoods was no longer a far-off suggestion. It was becoming a real option. In the wake of the Bay of Pigs disaster, Washington found itself in a strange and precarious state of reflection. Behind closed doors, anger festered. Not loud, not explosive, but cold and strategic. The failure had not only embarrassed the new president, but exposed the limits of American control in its own hemisphere. The idea that a small island nation could resist the will of the United States was unthinkable to some, intolerable to others. Yet, in public, restraint remained the policy. There could be no more reckless adventures, no more televised fiascos. Kennedy's administration had to show resolve, but not desperation. They had to act decisively, but invisibly. The tools of power would now include silence, shadows, and deception. It was in this atmosphere, heavy with pressure and bruised egos, that the seeds of a different kind of strategy began to grow. Inside the Pentagon, within the deepest levels of the Department of Defense, quiet discussions began to unfold. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, military men with lifetimes of experience in war, planning, and geopolitical chess, gathered to ask the one question no one dared ask in public. What if the enemy never strikes? But you still need a war. The concept was not entirely new. Throughout history, nations had found ways to manufacture justification for conflict. From ancient provocations at city gates to mysterious explosions on distant waters, the story of war had often begun with a convenient spark. But in the modern age, an age of mass media, of television, of global headlines, a single incident could shape perception on a national scale. The plan began to take form not in rage, but in logic. It would be framed as contingency, as preparedness, a just-in-case strategy, a series of proposals, sketches, hypothetical scenarios. In official documents, it would be labeled pretext operations. In the back rooms of the Pentagon, however, it was spoken of differently, more directly, more bluntly. A plan to trick the American public into supporting a war with Cuba. It would eventually be called Operation Northwoods. At its heart, the strategy was simple. If real Cuban aggression could not be provoked, it would be simulated. The idea was to stage attacks on American soil or against American assets and blame them on Cuba. These would not be minor events. They would be dramatic, visible, and emotionally charged. Enough to stir fear, to demand action, to give the president the leverage needed to act. But there was something else, something quieter behind the official language. For those crafting Northwoods, this was about more than Cuba. It was about proving a point, reclaiming initiative, showing that the United States still controlled the board, even when pieces had been lost. As the draft circulated, more ideas were added. Some were elaborate, some were disturbingly creative. A fake plane hijacking, a real ship set ablaze in Guantanamo Bay, innocent civilians portrayed as victims of Cuban brutality. There were proposals to explode bombs in American cities, carefully timed and controlled, of course, with planted evidence to suggest Cuban involvement. Some suggested staging funerals with grieving actors. Others drew up diagrams of fake aircraft, painted to resemble commercial liners, rigged to vanish or crash. Each proposal came with charts, costs, and contingencies, everything meticulously detailed. On paper, it was just planning. In person, it was something else. There were those who hesitated. Not everyone in the room was comfortable, but the momentum was strong and the pressure was subtle. After all, the reasoning was always the same. This plan will only be used if absolutely necessary. This is preparation, not execution. They told themselves the end justified the means, that it was better to deceive than to bleed, that a lie, if it avoided a larger war, might even be a form of peace. But behind every carefully typed page lay a quiet contradiction. To protect democracy, they would consider manipulating the very people they claimed to serve. And so, as spring turned to summer, Operation Northwoods moved closer to completion. The strategy was born, not in the chaos of battle, but in the stillness of air-conditioned rooms, under fluorescent lights, behind secure doors where ethics bent beneath the weight of perceived necessity. It was no longer just a concept. It was a plan. Filed, reviewed, ready. All it needed now was approval. In the world of high command, decisions are rarely painted in black and white. They are made in shades of strategy, cast under the harsh light of national interest. Words like honor and truth may appear in public speeches, but behind closed doors, the vocabulary changes. Behind those locked Pentagon doors, where Operation Northwoods took shape, truth was no longer a virtue. It was a variable. To those who championed the plan, deception was not betrayal. It was a weapon, a tool, just like a missile or a submarine, quiet, precise, and effective. These were men hardened by war, shaped by decades of conflict and compromise. They had seen entire cities leveled, alliances forged in secret, lives lost over miscalculations. To them, the world was not ruled by ideals, but by leverage. The proposal to fake attacks and stage tragedies did not come with dramatic speeches or pounding fists. It came with spreadsheets, timelines, risk assessments. The tone of the Northwoods documents was not emotional. It was surgical. Cool, analytical, restrained. As if the explosion of an empty ship or the faking of civilian deaths were merely items on a checklist. And perhaps, to those writing it, that's exactly what they were. But beneath the surface of that calm language lay a storm of ethical questions. Questions that, for many, went unspoken. Was it justifiable to terrify your own people in order to protect them? Could freedom be defended by eroding the very trust that bound a nation together? Could a lie truly serve liberty? The architects of the plan told themselves it was temporary, a necessity, a moment of deception to avoid a greater catastrophe. They pointed to Cuba, now firmly aligned with the Soviet Union, and warned of nuclear arms on the horizon. They spoke of worst-case scenarios, missiles in Havana, agents in Miami, a domino effect across Latin America. They invoked the Cold War's favorite phrase, mutually assured destruction. And in the face of that abyss, truth began to feel negotiable. Yet even among the Joint Chiefs, there were flickers of doubt. Some officers paused as they read the proposals. Others raised quiet questions in private, never publicly, never recorded. Dissent, after all, is delicate in rooms where everyone wears a star on their collar. Silence becomes safer. Conformity becomes armor. There were whispers, among aides, among staff, that Northwoods felt too far, that it crossed a line too sacred to breach. But the momentum was difficult to stop. The plan wasn't born of malice. It was born of fear. And fear has a way of bending even the strongest principles. At the center of it all stood a simple justification. If it prevents war, it is worth it. If the American people could be convinced, if only briefly, that Cuba had attacked them, then action could be taken swiftly. The military could neutralize the threat before it grew. Lives could be saved. And when the dust settled, when the truth eventually emerged, the cost would be forgiven, perhaps even forgotten. It was a cold logic, a logic not of villains, but of patriots trapped by pressure. Men who had spent their lives serving a country they now believed was under immediate threat. Not from within, but from without. And so they convinced themselves. They convinced themselves that the people didn't need to know, not now. That a fabricated act of war, if it led to real security, would be remembered as strategy, not sin. That history, as always, would be kind to the victors. In that way, Operation Northwoods was not only a military plan, it was a mirror, held up to a government forced to choose between the ideals it preached and the power it craved. In the end, the generals did not shout. They did not bang fists on tables or declare manifestos. They drafted, they stamped, they submitted, and then they waited. For one man, one decision. By the time the final draft of Operation Northwoods was assembled, it no longer resembled a simple set of contingency plans. It was something else entirely. An intricate mosaic of imagined disasters, crafted with eerie precision. Each proposal, though fictional in intent, was outlined with the same seriousness as any real battle strategy. There were maps, targets, timelines. And there was one common goal: to make the American public believe that Cuba had declared war. The document was clinical, but its contents were chilling. One plan suggested staging a bombing at a crowded public event, perhaps in Miami or Washington, where innocent civilians would appear to be injured or killed. The blast would be real, or appear convincingly so, but carefully controlled to limit actual casualties. The aftermath would be designed for cameras, ambulances rushing in, news crews capturing the chaos, and fabricated evidence pointing to Cuban operatives. Another proposal involved the hijacking of a commercial airliner. The plan was to use a drone, an unmanned aircraft painted to resemble a civilian jet. The drone would be filled with remote explosives and flown along a path near Cuban airspace. Then it would be detonated mid-flight, and the wreckage would be discovered at sea. A fabricated passenger list would include innocent American names. The Cuban government would be blamed for an attack that had never truly occurred. There were even darker concepts. One suggested simulating the shooting down of a U.S. Air Force plane, one secretly unmanned, over Cuban territory, to provoke outrage. Another proposed creating a communist Cuban terror campaign within Florida itself. This would include fake bombings, arson attacks, and the targeting of Cuban exiles opposed to Castro, all intended to make it seem as though the Cuban government was orchestrating violence inside the United States. The scope of the plan reached beyond the mainland. Some ideas focused on Guantanamo Bay, the U.S. naval base on Cuban soil. Military uniforms would be swapped. Sabotage could be arranged. An ammunition depot could be blown up in a staged event, making it appear that Cuban forces had struck first. Even a staged funeral for a fallen American soldier was considered, complete with a grieving family and full military honors, all built on a lie. What was striking about these proposals was not just their inventiveness, but their intent to manipulate public perception so fully, so immediately, that resistance would become unthinkable. Every scenario was aimed at one emotional target: fear. The kind of fear that hardens hearts, silences debate, and unites a nation behind its leaders. These attacks were never meant to defeat Cuba militarily. They were meant to shift the American mind, to erase hesitation, to build consensus not with truth, but with theater. And for the planners behind Northwoods, that distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was results. There were discussions of who would carry out each step, how the press would be notified, how intelligence reports would be crafted, how plausible deniability could be maintained. The plan's architects understood the power of spectacle. They understood that in the age of television, images mattered more than facts. If the American people could see smoke rising from a bombed building, or weep at the loss of fictional innocence, their response would be immediate and unquestioning. The detail was overwhelming. The document did not flinch. There was no room for ethics between bullet points. And yet, reading it today, it's difficult not to feel a chill. Not because the plans were devious, but because they were so calculated. There was no joy in the deception, only strategy, only silence. The proposed attacks of Operation Northwoods never materialized, but they were real, written, reviewed, signed. They existed in the hands of generals who believed, if only briefly, that the best way to protect a democracy was to fool it. For Operation Northwoods to succeed, its architects understood that the act alone was not enough. The explosion, the crash, the blood-stained debris, these were only the spark. The true power of the plan lay in what followed. The story, the narrative, the message that would sweep through headlines, echo across radio waves, and flicker through television screens in millions of American homes. The story that would tell the nation exactly who to blame. And the villain had already been chosen. It would be Cuba. From the very beginning, the plan's language was precise. Every proposal, every staged attack, every planted clue, every scripted tragedy was designed with one singular goal: to make it appear that the Cuban government, under Fidel Castro, was behind it all. And not just to military officials or policymakers. The deception had to reach deeper. It had to convince the American public. It had to shape not just opinion, but belief. The plan called for evidence, manufactured, planted, or fabricated. Weapons allegedly smuggled from Havana. Letters written in Spanish, planted on so-called captured saboteurs. Maps with Cuban naval routes, conveniently discovered in staged enemy encampments. Every detail designed to point in one direction, toward a foreign aggressor whose hostility could no longer be ignored. Media would play a central role. In the age of television, images had more impact than speeches. A single photograph of a bombed civilian site, a blurred video of alleged Cuban agents running from a scene, or a tearful mother at a staged funeral. All of these could tell a story more convincingly than any politician. The plan even suggested coordinating with journalists, ensuring coverage that would be immediate and unambiguous. There would be no time for skepticism, only shock, followed by anger. And once that narrative took hold, it would be difficult to unravel. The American people, still reeling from the trauma of the Bay of Pigs and fearful of communism's spread, were primed for a clear and simple explanation. In moments of uncertainty, clarity, no matter how false, feels like truth. The planners of Northwoods knew this. They depended on it. The goal was not to destroy Cuba in one decisive blow. The goal was to create enough fury, enough certainty, that public support for intervention would swell overnight. Congress would have no choice but to respond. Military assets could be deployed with confidence. The president would have a unified nation behind him. And Cuba? Cuba would be isolated, condemned, reduced to an aggressor on the global stage. Any plea of innocence would sound hollow in the roar of American outrage. But perhaps most chilling was the calm with which this entire machinery of manipulation was discussed. There were no flourishes in the Northwoods proposal, no fiery rhetoric, no dramatic declarations. Only logic, only method. It read like a blueprint, not a betrayal. And in that coldness, it became something more than just a military operation. It became a lesson in how fragile truth can be when shaped by power. The plan's creators never questioned whether the American people should be misled. They only asked how to do it most effectively. To blame Cuba was not merely strategic. It was symbolic. It sent a message to every enemy, every ally, every wavering neutral observer across the globe, that the United States would not hesitate to protect its interests, even if it meant rewriting reality. And for a brief moment in history, that message came perilously close to being delivered. Among the pages of the Northwoods proposal, hidden between bland bureaucratic language and emotionless briefings, were the outlines of ideas so provocative, so disturbing, that they read more like fragments from a thriller novel than real military strategy. But they were real. Signed, reviewed, circulated. These were not fantasies whispered in the dark. They were action plans, written by senior officials within the United States Department of Defense. And they began with airplanes. One of the most detailed proposals involved the hijacking, or more accurately, the illusion of a hijacking, of a civilian aircraft. The operation would begin with a standard passenger flight departing from the eastern United States, bound for a Central American destination. On board, a group of real passengers, selected, monitored, and replaced at the last moment, would never reach their destination. Instead, the original plane would be secretly switched out for an unmarked drone, designed to resemble a commercial airliner. The drone would follow the original flight path and, at a predetermined moment, transmit a distress signal. "Mayday, Mayday, Cuban MiGs have attacked us." Then silence. Somewhere over the sea, the drone would be remotely detonated. Wreckage would be scattered across the waves. Debris would be discovered by search teams. And a fabricated passenger list, filled with fictional American citizens, would be broadcast to the world. Faces, names, families, all invented, all grieving. The public would awaken to a tragedy. Newspapers would print full-page memorials. Leaders would demand action. And Cuba, accused of murdering innocent civilians, would stand defenseless in the court of world opinion. But it did not stop there. Another proposal described using an American military aircraft, specifically an F-101 fighter jet, disguised as a Cuban MiG. The plan was to paint the aircraft with Cuban markings and have it engage in mock combat with real U.S. planes near American airspace. A staged attack would follow, in which the faux Cuban jet would fire blank rounds, then retreat. The footage would be recorded, the radio chatter scripted. A fictional aggression, designed to provoke a very real response. And then there were the ships. In Guantanamo Bay, the U.S. naval base on Cuban territory, Northwoods suggested orchestrating a series of explosions, fires in fuel depots, sabotage of aircraft, and even the sinking of a U.S. ship in the harbor. The cause? Cuban agents, supposedly caught red-handed. A dramatic photograph of smoke rising from the bay, a blurred figure fleeing into the jungle. It was all that would be needed. Each of these proposed events shared one purpose: to shock. Not to win a battle, but to win minds. The public's trust would not be lost in a single day. It would be given willingly in the face of horror. And yet, behind the explosive drama lay something even more unsettling: the calm, systematic planning of it all. There were contingency options, fallback scenarios, even discussions about how to protect operational secrecy. Who would fly the drone? Who would deliver the false evidence? How would the president be briefed? The logic was airtight. The ethics were never truly addressed. The Northwoods plans relied on something darker than bombs or bullets. They relied on belief, on the certainty that, in a crisis, people would not ask too many questions. That emotion would eclipse doubt. That fear would silence truth. To imagine hijackings, explosions, and staged deaths is one thing. To plan them, on American soil, against American citizens with the intent to deceive the nation, is another. And yet, in the pages of Operation Northwoods, it was all laid bare. A chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous battlefield is trust itself. For all its complexity, Operation Northwoods pointed toward a single, deliberate destination: justification. The hijackings, the explosions, the planted evidence, the public mourning. These were never the end. They were the means, the gateway. The performance carefully designed to lead the American people step by step to the conclusion that war was not only necessary, but inevitable. The architects of the plan understood the process. They had studied it. They had watched it unfold in other places, in other conflicts. Public outrage was a powerful force, volatile, swift, and hungry for resolution. The trick was to give it a target, a narrative, a villain that felt close, tangible, and dangerous. In this case, that villain was Cuba. Once the attacks had been staged and the evidence disseminated, the momentum would begin. The press, fed by official statements, intelligence briefings, and graphic visuals, would run the headlines: Cuban agents strike U.S. targets. American lives lost in unprovoked attack. President weighs military response. Television anchors would speak in grave tones. Radio broadcasts would loop survivor testimonies. Newspapers would print faces of the fictional victims. In churches and classrooms, in diners and living rooms, Americans would speak the same words: something must be done. That was the fulcrum. And then the response would unfold, not in secrecy, but in spectacle. Congress, stunned by the scale of the aggression, would hold emergency hearings. The president would address the nation, solemn, righteous, steady. He would not speak of retaliation. He would speak of defense, not conquest, but justice. The invasion would be framed not as ambition, but as a necessity. A last resort, reluctantly embraced for the safety of the free world. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, already equipped with invasion plans for Cuba, would move swiftly. Troop deployments would begin under the pretense of humanitarian rescue. Naval vessels would encircle the island. Airfields would be prepared. And while diplomacy would be mentioned in passing, the course would already be set. For the American public, the path from tragedy to action would feel natural, even righteous. Every image, every statement, every policy would reinforce a single unbreakable story. We were attacked, and now we are defending ourselves. In that moment, dissent would be difficult. Questions would feel unpatriotic. The machinery of democracy, designed for debate and deliberation, would move with chilling efficiency, and the world would watch. Allies would be briefed. Enemies would be warned. Neutral nations would be reminded that this was not aggression, but order restored. The script was ready, written not in truth, but in perception. The audience was global. The stakes, enormous. For those in the Pentagon, this was strategy at its most precise. The perfect blend of fear and control. A masterstroke of psychological warfare, not aimed at an enemy population, but at their own. And perhaps that is what makes it most haunting of all. The invasion of Cuba in this vision would not begin with missiles or tanks, but with tears, with funerals, with flags lowered to half-mast and news anchors pausing solemnly between words. It would begin with a story written by generals, directed by strategists, believed by millions. And in the end, if it succeeded, no one would question why. Because the truth, once drowned in grief and rage, would vanish into silence. While the Pentagon shaped Operation Northwoods behind layers of military protocol and strategy, another institution loomed nearby. Quiet, powerful, and ever watchful. The Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA was no stranger to secrecy, no stranger to shadow. By the early 1960s, it had already become a master of covert operations, a silent force acting not in front of cameras, but behind curtains, beyond borders, and often beyond oversight. To understand Operation Northwoods fully, one must understand the world the CIA had helped shape. This was the agency that orchestrated coups in Iran and Guatemala, that trained operatives in remote jungle camps, that used false identities and radio signals, forged passports and poisons. It dealt in information, misinformation, and the subtle manipulation of perception. It did not need to stage entire wars to achieve its ends. It only needed to bend belief. So when the Pentagon began to explore the idea of using deception as a path to war, the presence of the CIA was inevitable, if not always visible. Though Operation Northwoods was a product of the Department of Defense, many of its ideas mirrored techniques long mastered by the CIA. Psychological operations, false narratives, staged photos, synthetic identities. These were the bread and butter of Langley's most secret divisions. The agency had even established entire units focused on what it called perception engineering. In their world, truth was just one of many tools. Believability mattered more. In Cuba, the CIA had already run operations under the name Operation Mongoose, a long-term campaign to undermine and destabilize Castro's regime through sabotage, propaganda, and covert interference. Exploding cigars, poisoned wetsuits, assassination attempts cloaked as accidents. These were not rumors, but archived plans. Northwoods, in that sense, was not born in a vacuum. It was a sibling to Mongoose, drawn from the same dark well of Cold War desperation. But unlike Mongoose, Northwoods took the strategy a step further. It didn't just aim to destabilize a foreign government, it aimed to deceive the American public itself. And here, the CIA's role became more delicate. The agency was protective of its independence. It operated outside the military chain of command, answering directly to the president. It had its own goals, its own vision. And while collaboration between the CIA and the military was not uncommon, it was often fraught with friction. Each group believed in its own methods. Each guarded its secrets. Still, cooperation existed in the margins. Some of Northwood's proposals seemed tailor-made for CIA execution. The planting of evidence, the manipulation of media, the coordination of false narratives across borders. These were tactics Langley had refined for years. And though the CIA did not officially endorse the Northwoods plan, nor appear in its formal authorship, its fingerprints were faintly present, like shadows at the edges of a classified memo. It is also worth noting that, at the time, relations between the Kennedy administration and the CIA were strained. After the failure at the Bay of Pigs, a mission largely crafted by the CIA and reluctantly approved by the president, trust had eroded. Kennedy had dismissed CIA Director Allen Dulles and vowed to reform the agency's structure. And so, when Northwoods emerged, there was uncertainty. Would the CIA support another drastic covert plan? Or had the Bay of Pigs made them more cautious? The answer may lie in the silence that followed. Operation Northwoods was ultimately presented to the Secretary of Defense and, eventually, to the White House. The CIA did not block it, nor did it champion it. Like many things in the world of intelligence, it hovered in ambiguity. What is clear, however, is this. The atmosphere that allowed Northwoods to be conceived was one in which the lines between truth and fabrication were already blurred. It was a time when intelligence and warfare had become intertwined, not with bullets, but with belief. And the CIA, as always, moved through that world with practiced ease. In the story of Northwoods, the CIA remains just off stage. Not the author, perhaps, but a mentor to the method. A silent advisor to the art of deception. And in a nation where secrets were currency, it was perhaps the only role they ever needed to play. While the Pentagon quietly drafted its plans to deceive the American public, another operation was already underway. Hidden from headlines, buried in classified briefings, and pulsing with the urgency of obsession. Its name was Operation Mongoose. Unlike Northwoods, which never left the drawing board, Operation Mongoose was activated, funded, staffed, approved by the highest levels of government. It began in late 1961 under the direct supervision of the White House, the CIA, and a group known simply as the Special Group, an elite committee that operated behind the veil of national security. Its mission was brutally simple. Remove Fidel Castro from power by any means necessary. And so began one of the most expansive covert campaigns in U.S. history. Mongoose was not a single plan, but a sprawling constellation of operations. Political subversion, economic sabotage, assassination plots, psychological warfare. It sought to suffocate Castro's Cuba from the inside out, to destabilize the regime, turn the people against it, and if possible, eliminate the man at its center. Within the CIA's clandestine halls, agents brainstormed with unnerving creativity. Exploding cigars, poisoned pens, contaminated diving suits. There were schemes to drug Castro before public appearances so he would slur his words and humiliate himself. Others involved triggering false religious prophecies, hoping to turn the Cuban people against their leader through manipulated superstition. While some of these ideas bordered on the absurd, others were deadly serious. Ships carrying weapons and supplies to Cuba were targeted. Rebel groups on the island were secretly armed and trained. Radio signals were hijacked to spread anti-Castro messaging. Agricultural sabotage was used to ruin crops and sow unrest among farmers. And in all of it, deniability was the golden rule. No trace could lead back to Langley. No operation could be tied directly to the United States government. Every act of disruption had to appear spontaneous, internal, native to Cuba itself. The CIA understood that plausible deniability was more powerful than firepower. If the story could be controlled, the chaos would be tolerated. But Mongoose was more than tactics. It was culture. A mindset that took root inside the US government, especially among those convinced that Castro's continued existence was a personal failure of the American intelligence community. The shadow of the Bay of Pigs still loomed large, and many saw Mongoose as redemption. There was also urgency. U.S. officials feared that with every passing month, Cuba grew more deeply entwined with the Soviet Union. The longer Castro survived, the greater the risk of nuclear escalation. Mongoose was to be the slow knife, cutting steadily, quietly, until the regime bled out. And yet, for all its ambition, Operation Mongoose never achieved its goal. Castro remained in power. His speeches grew longer, not shorter. His beard remained untouched. Despite years of sabotage, harassment, and infiltration, the revolution endured. Still, Mongoose left a mark, not just on Cuba, but on American policy itself. It shaped a generation of clandestine warfare. It blurred the lines between diplomacy and deception, between foreign policy and secret war. And in its cold logic and relentless experimentation, it mirrored the same principles that underpinned Operation Northwoods. The two were siblings in secrecy. Mongoose acted in the shadows. Northwoods, had it been approved, would have brought the shadows home. One targeted a regime, the other targeted perception. Together, they represented a troubling truth, that in the struggle for control, even democracies can drift into darkness. And in the race to stop an enemy, they risk becoming the very thing they claim to oppose. On the morning of April 17, 1961, the beaches of Playa Girón echoed with gunfire. Under a rising Caribbean sun, waves of armed Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the CIA, stormed the southern shore of Cuba, hoping to ignite a national uprising against Fidel Castro. It was a plan born of secrecy and high hopes, sold to President Kennedy as a surgical strike that would end a rising communist threat without leaving American fingerprints behind. But almost from the first moment, the operation began to unravel. The intelligence had been flawed. The resistance inside Cuba, far from eager to rise up, remained silent. Castro's forces, forewarned and well-armed, responded with speed and fury. And when things went wrong, as they quickly did, there was no cavalry, no American air support, no reinforcements. The fighters on the beach were left to fend for themselves, trapped between ocean and enemy fire. After just 3 days, the mission collapsed. Over 100 men lay dead. More than 1,000 were captured. And what was intended as a covert operation became an international humiliation. The world now knew the truth. Despite initial denials, it became clear that the United States had orchestrated the invasion. In Havana, Castro used the failure as propaganda gold, proof that imperialist America would stop at nothing to crush his revolution. In Moscow, Soviet leaders took note of Washington's recklessness. And across Latin America, resentment simmered. For the Kennedy administration, the political fallout was immediate and severe. But behind the public shame, behind the carefully worded statements and solemn press conferences, there was something else, something deeper. Inside the corridors of the White House and the Pentagon, trust was fractured. Kennedy, still early in his presidency, felt betrayed by the CIA, by his advisors, perhaps even by his own instincts. The plan he had approved, reluctantly and with conditions, had been a disaster, a gamble that cost lives and credibility. And though the CIA had presented the mission as minimal risk, the president now understood how easily intelligence could mislead. He was furious. He dismissed senior officials. CIA Director Allen Dulles, one of the agency's founding architects, was forced into early retirement. The agency's structure and methods were questioned. And Kennedy, privately, though firmly, vowed never again to be cornered by a secret plan with no exit. But not everyone in Washington took the lesson that way. To the Joint Chiefs of Staff and hardliners within the military, the failure of the Bay of Pigs was not a reason for restraint. It was a reason for escalation. They argued that the problem had not been the mission itself, but the lack of commitment. If the United States had supported the invasion with airstrikes, with troops, with full force, the outcome might have been different. Castro might have fallen. Communism might have been crushed before it could spread further. This was the atmosphere in which Operation Northwoods began to take shape. A moment of bitterness, a moment of wounded pride, a moment where the frustration of limited action gave way to thoughts of broader, bolder moves. The appetite for plausible deniability remained, but now it was fueled by something more urgent. the fear of appearing weak. Northwoods, in many ways, was the ghost of the Bay of Pigs, reborn in paperwork and hypotheticals. Where the invasion had failed through miscalculation, the generals now sought to create the perfect pretext, one that would guarantee public support, eliminate hesitation, and allow for a decisive strike. And yet, as plans circulated and meetings continued, a darker truth began to crystallize. The same impulse that had led to failure on the beaches of Cuba now threatened to lead America into something even more dangerous. Not just a war abroad, but a deception at home. The Bay of Pigs had shown the limits of force without support. Northwoods aimed to solve that problem by manufacturing the support. And in that, it revealed the lengths to which fear, shame, and ambition can push even the most powerful nation on earth. It was a quiet morning in Washington. Outside the White House, the breeze was light, the trees just beginning to blossom with the arrival of spring. The grounds were still, save for the occasional click of heels or the rustle of a freshly delivered newspaper. Within the marble corridors of power, aides and officials moved with the familiar rhythm of government. Unhurried, but never idle. There was no reason to suspect that today would be different. Inside the Oval Office, President John F. Kennedy sat behind the resolute desk, a mug of cooling coffee beside a modest stack of folders. His mood, as usual, was composed. He had grown used to the steady cadence of national leadership. Briefings, meetings, decisions layered upon decisions. Each day brought intelligence updates, diplomatic cables, policy proposals, and among them, just one more document, lay a thin manila folder marked Top Secret. It was handed to him without ceremony. No warning, no urgency in tone, just one more item for review. But as Kennedy opened it and began to read, the quiet equilibrium of the room began to shift. The pages were neat, clinical. Paragraphs typed in the familiar language of the military bureaucracy. Precise, unemotional. But the content was something else entirely. With each line, the reality of what was being proposed came into sharper focus. Hijackings, bombings, the staging of civilian deaths on American soil, the use of drones to simulate attacks, the destruction of property, the manufacturing of grief. Entire chains of events, carefully designed not to prevent war, but to create the illusion of one. All to be blamed on Cuba. Kennedy's eyes moved methodically down the pages, but behind them, a storm was building. His fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the paper. His jaw, relaxed just moments earlier, now tensed. The words were cold, matter of fact. There was no moral conflict within the document, only logistics. How many civilians could be targeted without arousing suspicion? How should the media be briefed? How best to ensure the president himself could plausibly deny involvement? He turned the page. There were diagrams, lists of potential sites, timelines, cost estimates, and woven through it all, the unspoken assumption that the American people could be manipulated like chess pieces, moved into anger and obedience without knowing the truth. Kennedy leaned back in his chair. For a moment, the document lay open on his desk, untouched. He stared out the window behind him, where the trees of the south lawn swayed gently in the breeze. It was a serene view, one that seemed to mock the violence described in the pages before him. He thought about the country outside these walls. Mothers preparing breakfast, students filing into classrooms, veterans walking their dogs, citizens who trusted their government, who believed in the flag that hung beside the door of this very room. And here, in his hands, was a plan to violate that trust in the most intimate way possible. Not by mistake, not by accident, but intentionally. The military officials who had supported Northwoods now sat silent across from him. Men of rank, discipline, and deep patriotism. In their view, this plan was not madness. It was strategy. A necessary evil in the face of global communism. A safeguard against uncertainty. A tool if things came to it. And perhaps that was what unsettled Kennedy the most. These weren't villains. These were experienced leaders. Intelligent, rational, devoted to national defense. They were not proposing Northwoods in malice, but out of a grim sense of duty. And yet, What they had conceived was something he could not accept. He looked down once more. The final page, the conclusion, a recommendation that the president approve the operation. Kennedy closed the folder slowly and deliberately. The silence in the room grew dense. The generals waited. Then, in a voice measured but firm, he spoke. No, just that. No elaboration, no apology, no anger, just clarity. He stood, lifting the file from his desk and holding it briefly in his hand, as if weighing not just paper, but the weight of a nation's moral compass. Then, with finality, he set it aside. This isn't what we do, he said quietly. Not in this country. Those words hung in the air like a curtain drawing shut. The meeting ended not with debate, but with stillness. There would be no approval, no signatures, no implementation. Operation Northwoods would be shelved, buried, locked away in a classified archive where it would sleep for decades. Unknown, unspoken, unacted upon. But the memory of that moment would linger. For Kennedy, it was more than the rejection of a plan. It was a reaffirmation of a principle. That truth mattered. That leadership was not measured in victories gained by deception, but in the integrity of the road taken. In the quiet of that room, he had made a choice, and in doing so, he had preserved something fragile, something invisible yet vital, the trust between a government and its people. The rejection of Operation Northwoods did not come with headlines. There were no leaks, no outbursts, no dramatic firings. No one stormed out of the Oval Office, and no microphones recorded the moment the president quietly set the plan aside. But within the circles of power, within the windowless conference rooms of the Pentagon and the hushed offices of military intelligence, the tremor was felt immediately. It was more than a policy denial. It was a personal rebuke. When John F. Kennedy said no to Northwoods, he wasn't just dismissing a strategy. He was drawing a line, a bright, deliberate line between military logic and democratic values. And for some within the Defense Department, that line stung. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had believed, perhaps naively, that they were offering a necessary solution to an unsolvable problem. They saw Cuba as a wound festering too close to the heart of the United States. In their eyes, they had merely prepared a path to intervention. Cleaner, safer, and more controlled than another botched invasion. Instead, they had been told, without anger but with certainty, that their solution was unacceptable. In the days and weeks that followed, the plan was quietly shelved. It did not circulate further. It did not return for revision. There was no second draft. Northwoods was placed in a secure file, labeled and stored. Another entry in the ever-growing archive of Cold War contingencies that never came to pass. For years, decades, it remained hidden, its pages untouched, its ideas forgotten by all but those who had signed off on them. Yet among those circles, the rejection sparked subtle but lasting changes. Within the Pentagon, there was frustration, though rarely spoken aloud. The generals who had endorsed the plan didn't resign or protest. They didn't have to. They simply adjusted. Some saw Kennedy's decision as weakness, an unwillingness to accept the hard necessities of modern power. Others, more introspective, began to question how far they had been willing to go, and why. At the CIA, the mood was more cautious. Although the agency had not authored Northwoods, its culture of secrecy and experimentation had shaped the environment in which such a plan could emerge. The failure of the Bay of Pigs had already strained the relationship between the White House and Langley. Now, with Northwoods rejected, it became clear that the president intended to assert stronger civilian control over the intelligence community. Kennedy's vision of power was not rooted in fear. He believed in restraint, in diplomacy, in the long game. And while he accepted the necessity of secrecy, he drew a firm boundary at deception aimed at the American public. This position did not go unnoticed. Behind the scenes, it added to the tensions already simmering between the president and elements of the national security establishment. He had fired CIA Director Allen Dulles. He had resisted calls for further escalation in Vietnam. He had questioned the assumptions that had guided U.S. foreign policy for years. To some, these actions made him principled. To others, dangerous. But Kennedy did not reverse course. He continued to demand accountability, transparency, and discipline. He understood that real strength did not come from staging tragedy, but from preventing it. And in the quiet burial of Operation Northwoods, he preserved something fragile yet essential: the moral integrity of the presidency. Still, the plan's very existence had left a shadow. Even though it was never carried out, even though it remained classified until decades later, the mere fact that it had been seriously proposed was a revelation. It exposed how easily fear could warp judgment. How, in the name of security, leaders could drift toward strategies that endangered the very values they claimed to protect. In the end, Northwoods faded into obscurity, filed away, unspoken, remembered by few. But its legacy remained. A cautionary tale, a crossroads in the quiet war between secrecy and democracy, and a moment in history when power blinked and chose, if only briefly, to turn away from the darkness. After its quiet rejection in 1962, Operation Northwoods vanished, not with fire, but with filing. It was not destroyed, nor shredded, nor wiped from existence. It was simply placed in a drawer, sealed, stamped, forgotten. It joined thousands of other documents locked away in the classified archives of the Department of Defense and the National Security Council, buried not beneath concrete or steel, but beneath layers of bureaucracy, silence, and time. No one spoke of it. No speeches were made. No investigations followed. And in an era where secrets were currency, its concealment was effortless. This was Washington's greatest talent. Not denial, but disappearance. The Cold War offered ample justification for secrecy. The specter of nuclear conflict hung over every decision, every memo. And so, the existence of a plan to fabricate war, however unacted upon, was deemed too dangerous for public scrutiny. It was locked behind the highest security clearances. Access was limited. References were redacted. Even those who knew of its existence chose not to speak its name again. And so, for over 30 years, Northwoods slept. Presidents came and went. Wars began and ended. The world changed, but the plan remained hidden, buried not only in archives, but in memory. It became one of many silent truths folded into the dark corners of American history, until something shifted. In the mid-1990s, a national reckoning with secrecy began to unfold. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union was gone. And in its wake, the American public began to ask questions about Vietnam, about Iran-Contra, about what else had been hidden during decades of geopolitical struggle. In 1994, a government board known as the Assassination Records Review Board, created in the wake of renewed interest in the JFK assassination, was granted access to decades' worth of classified material. Its mission was to uncover any and all documents that might shed light on the environment surrounding Kennedy's death. In the process, they opened a door that had long remained closed. Among thousands of pages of unrelated memoranda and military briefings, they found it: Operation Northwoods. The file was complete, labeled, signed, archived, forgotten, but intact. And when the contents were made public in 1997, the reaction was immediate and stunned. Americans read, many for the first time, that their government had once considered staging terrorist attacks against its own citizens, that leaders within the Pentagon had signed off on false flag operations meant to manipulate public opinion, that such deception had come close, dangerously close, to becoming reality. The headlines were brief but chilling. U.S. military proposed fake terror in Cuba. Documents revealed plans to deceive Americans into war. For some, it was simply another confirmation of what they had long suspected, that behind patriotism often lurked power, and that behind power often lay secrets. For others, it was a moment of betrayal, proof that even the most democratic systems were not immune to temptation. But perhaps the most profound reaction was this: silence. Because even with the documents made public, there was no scandal, no hearings, no criminal charges. The officials involved were long retired, many deceased. The president who had rejected the plan had himself been assassinated decades earlier. There was no accountability to be had, only awareness. Northwoods became history, disturbing, undeniable, and eerily prescient. It was taught in quiet lectures on ethics and intelligence work. cited in books about misinformation and media manipulation, and whispered about in the growing world of conspiracy, where it served as proof that governments could, and sometimes did, lie. But beyond all that, Northwoods became a symbol of how close a democracy can come to losing itself. Not to invasion, not to revolution, but to the quiet seduction of control. And it remained a reminder of something else, that even buried truths can rise again. When the contents of Operation Northwoods were finally declassified in 1997, they did not arrive with sirens or scandal. There were no primetime specials, no presidential apologies, no military resignations. They appeared quietly, as many truths do. Not with a bang, but with the soft rustle of paper being scanned, filed, and uploaded. And yet, for those who found them, for journalists, historians, and citizens attuned to the hidden mechanics of government, the revelation was seismic. It wasn't just what the documents said. It was who had signed them. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the United States, men entrusted with the defense of democracy, who had, in the early 1960s, calmly proposed deceiving the American public to launch a war against a much smaller nation. The language was bureaucratic, measured, but the implications were staggering. It was proof, unequivocal and official, that the US government had seriously considered attacking itself in order to justify an invasion of Cuba. News outlets picked up the story briefly. Headlines ran for a day or two. US military's shocking Cold War plot revealed. The plan to stage fake terror attacks on Americans. Television anchors spoke in hushed tones, summarizing the most chilling points. The hijacked planes, the planted evidence, the simulated funerals. The term false flag, once confined to military theory and fringe political circles, entered mainstream vocabulary. But the coverage was fleeting. In the 1990s, America was basking in post-Cold War triumph. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The economy was booming. The internet was just beginning to transform communication. For many, the past felt safely distant. Northwoods was disturbing, yes, but it was old. It had not happened, and the officials involved were long gone. It was a footnote, not a headline. Yet the documents did not fade away. They were downloaded, shared, discussed in classrooms, referenced in books, cited in growing online forums where citizens, journalists, and researchers gathered to question the official versions of history. For the rising generation of digital skeptics, Northwoods became more than an event. It became evidence. It confirmed the idea that democratic governments, under pressure, could contemplate undemocratic actions, that narratives could be engineered, that truth could be shaped by strategy. Among historians, the revelation sparked new debates about the limits of executive power and the role of public trust in foreign policy. In university seminars and think tanks, scholars now had a concrete case to point to when teaching about psychological operations, media manipulation, and the hidden layers of Cold War policy. And in the rising undercurrent of American society, in the growing community of conspiracy theorists, Northwoods became something else entirely. A symbol. Proof that conspiracies weren't just imagined. That sometimes they were written, stamped, signed, and shelved. When people asked, would the government ever lie to us? The answer was no longer theoretical. The answer was Northwoods. The story of its rejection, too, became part of its legend. That President John F. Kennedy, upon reading the proposal, had refused it flatly, had drawn the line others would not. To some, that act was one of principle. To others, it added fuel to darker speculations about the forces aligned against him in the final months of his life. By the end of the 1990s, Northwoods had found its place in the American consciousness, not as a dark secret, but as a dark truth, archived, admitted, real. And in that quiet truth, a new kind of awareness took root. The idea that democracy requires vigilance not just from those in power, but from those who choose to believe in it. There comes a moment in every nation's history when it must decide not what it is willing to fight against, but what it is willing to fight for. Operation Northwoods was one such moment. Though it was never enacted, its very conception revealed something deep and unsettling about the machinery of modern power. It showed that even in a nation founded on liberty, governed by a constitution and fueled by democratic ideals. Fear can cloud judgment, and strategy can eclipse principle. The men who authored Northwoods did not consider themselves villains. They wore stars and medals. They had served in war, lost comrades, defended their flag. In their minds, they were patriots, acting in defense of the homeland. They did not dream of tyranny. They planned for victory. They believed the end justified the means. But that is the oldest moral trap in politics. For throughout history, some of the gravest injustices have been committed not out of cruelty, but out of conviction. Not by those who sought to destroy their nation, but by those who claimed to save it. In the Cold War, paranoia was currency. The fear of communism, of nuclear war, of dominoes falling in faraway places, turned intelligent men into architects of illusion. It became acceptable, even logical, to fabricate the justification for war, so long as it preserved the balance of power. And in that transformation, patriotism became distorted. It was no longer about service or honesty or faith in the people. It became about control. Control of the narrative, control of emotion, control of the citizens' trust. But democracy does not thrive in control. It thrives in consent, and consent by nature must be informed. To manipulate that consent through fear, through lies, through false flag operations, is to fracture the very foundation of democratic governance. And yet, this temptation lingers in every generation. Every time a government asks itself, what if we staged a threat to rally support? What if the people won't understand unless we show them something they'll fear? What if we can protect freedom by suspending the truth? It is then, in that moment of rationalized deception, that ethics must speak louder than strategy. What Kennedy did when he rejected Operation Northwoods was not only protect the people from a lie, he protected the nation from itself. He understood that power is not inherently noble, that it must be held in check, not just by laws and courts, but by conscience. His refusal was a reminder that patriotism is not blind obedience. It is the courage to tell truth to power, the discipline to hold to principle when principle becomes inconvenient, the clarity to know that deception, even in the name of protection, can never be the foundation of trust. The legacy of Northwoods is not only in what it proposed, but in what it forced us to confront: the fragile line between safeguarding a nation and undermining the very values that make that nation worth safeguarding. It is easy to condemn the plan in hindsight. Harder is the question it leaves us with still. In moments of fear, when the world feels unstable and enemies loom large, what are we, as a people, willing to accept in the name of safety? And what truths are we willing to lose? Let us imagine a different morning in Washington. Let us imagine that when President John F. Kennedy opened the Northwoods folder, he did not close it in silence. Let us imagine that instead of a quiet no, there was a reluctant pause, and then a quiet, calculated yes. Let us imagine a world where Operation Northwoods was not buried, but born. It begins with an explosion. A modest-sized bomb detonates in Miami, on a street near the Cuban exile community. No lives lost, but enough glass, enough fire, enough smoke to make the headlines. The very next day, a commercial plane vanishes off the coast of Florida. A distress call. Cuban fighters approaching, and then static. Wreckage is found. A list of names: American civilians, families, teachers, travelers, released to the press. Funerals are held, flags lowered. Then comes the press conference. The president, grave and direct, speaks of unprovoked aggression. The Joint Chiefs deliver intelligence reports to Congress, citing growing Cuban hostility, intercepted communications, blurry photos of what appear to be missile installations near Havana. The headlines write themselves. Castro attacks. Communist threat at our doorstep. America must respond. Public opinion surges. Approval ratings climb. Critics fall silent. Within days, military action is underway. Naval blockades tighten. Airstrikes begin on military targets in Cuba. By the end of the month, a full-scale invasion is in motion. American troops land, not under protest, but with cheers and camera flashes. The world watches. The United Nations is paralyzed. The Soviet Union, caught off guard, hesitates. Fidel Castro resists. He arms civilians, fortifies cities, broadcasts speeches into the wind. But without the global sympathy he once held, and under the crushing weight of American firepower, his resistance falters. Within weeks, Havana falls. The revolution collapses. A US-backed government is installed. Cuba becomes free again. But freedom, in this version of history, comes at a terrible price. The lie must be maintained. The victims of the staged attacks are honored year after year. Monuments built, stories written, entire generations raised on a myth. Anyone who questions the official version is dismissed. Conspiracy theorists, radicals, troublemakers. Documents are classified, whistleblowers silenced. And slowly, the methods of Northwoods do not fade. They evolve. The success of the plan emboldens the architects. In future crises, in Vietnam, in Central America, in the Middle East, the precedent stands. Create the threat. Justify the response. A new playbook is born, where deception becomes policy and consent is crafted, not earned. Inside the intelligence community, a culture of distortion takes root. Operations once considered unthinkable are now simply classified. Presidents inherit not only the nuclear codes, but the machinery of illusion. The line between real and constructed threats blurs. Citizens live in constant alert, patriotic, afraid, unquestioning. At home, the long-term cost begins to show. Trust in institutions erodes. But unlike in our world, where skepticism emerges from truth being revealed, here the public never learns the truth. And so, the mistrust is quieter, deeper, harder to trace. People sense that something is wrong, but cannot name it. Civic life grows hollow. Elections feel meaningless. Journalism becomes less about investigation, more about amplification. And abroad, the invasion of Cuba, built on a manufactured story, ignites a wave of reaction. The Soviet Union, humiliated, accelerates its militarization. Nuclear deployments increase, not just in Europe, but in Asia, the Arctic, and Africa. Proxy wars intensify. Nations begin to wonder, if the United States is willing to lie to its own people, what would it do to us? The world grows colder, more paranoid, less stable. And when the Cuban Missile Crisis comes, if it comes at all, it is no longer a moment of near-miss diplomacy. It is an explosion waiting to happen. In this world, one decision, the approval of a single plan, creates a cascade of events from which the world may never recover. Not because the lie was so large, but because it worked. History, in this alternate timeline, remembers Castro as a madman. The documents revealing the truth about Northwoods remain classified well into the 21st century. And even when they are finally released, they are dismissed, because too much depends on the lie. The monuments, the veterans, the speeches, the pride. Truth by then is not just dangerous. It is incompatible with the version of history people have been taught to love. And so it is ignored. But we do not live in that world. In our world, someone said no. The plan was shelved. The lie was never lived. And though other mistakes were made, wars fought, truths bent, Northwoods became not a precedent, but a warning, a shadow of what might have been, a future narrowly avoided, a line not crossed. And for that, history owes a quiet debt. History is more than a list of dates and battles. It is a memory shaped by choice, by what is remembered, what is forgotten, and what is intentionally buried. Operation Northwoods may not be among the most well-known events of the Cold War, but it remains one of its most haunting. Not because the plan was carried out, but because it almost was. Because the minds that conceived it did so not in hatred, but in the name of defense. Because the deception was never meant to harm the nation. It was meant to protect it. And that, perhaps, is what makes it so dangerous. In studying Northwoods, we are not simply looking at a canceled military plan. We are holding a mirror to the nature of power itself. We are reminded that even in the most stable democracies, the pressures of fear and urgency can twist noble intentions into shadowy logic. That in moments of geopolitical tension, Even the most trusted leaders can be tempted to trade transparency for control, to swap truth for narrative. But history is not just a record of what was. It is also a map of what could have been. That folder, presented to a young president in a quiet room, was more than paper. It was a test, a quiet crossroads. And in saying no, Kennedy did more than reject a strategy. He preserved a boundary that too easily might have been erased. He reminded the nation that patriotism does not mean obedience, that strength is not measured by how convincingly we deceive, but by how courageously we remain honest, even when it would be easier not to. In the years that followed, other conflicts came. Other mistakes were made. The world changed, and with it, the methods of war and diplomacy. But the story of Northwoods, when it finally came to light decades later, became a whisper of caution. A reminder that trust between a people and its government is not automatic. It is earned. And it can be lost not only by failure, but by quiet betrayal. That trust is fragile, and that fragility is not weakness. It is what makes democracy living, human, and rare. It requires vigilance, not from institutions alone, but from each of us. From every reader of history, every citizen, every voice that dares to question and seek and understand. Because truth, when forgotten or ignored, does not disappear. It waits. It waits in archives. It waits in silence. It waits in documents once sealed, in plans once approved, in moments once almost taken. Operation Northwoods reminds us that the darkest threats are not always foreign. Sometimes they are domestic. Sometimes they are ideas, well-intentioned, logical, persuasive, that blur the line between safeguarding freedom and redefining it entirely. And so we remember not to dwell in fear, but to remain awake. Not to assign blame, but to stay alert. Not to distrust by default, but to always ask the right questions. Because the health of any democracy rests not only in its power to act, but in its wisdom to pause. And tonight, as you drift to sleep, let this story settle not as a nightmare, but as a lesson. A quiet assurance that history, when examined with care, can protect us still. That even the most troubling truths once faced can become light in the darkness. Let the past rest now. Let the night soften. Let the silence be one of reflection, not fear. Tomorrow waits, and with it, the chance to choose again. Now that the story has been told, and the last chapter rests behind you, take a moment to breathe. Let the silence settle, not as a void, but as a space for reflection. You've walked alongside history's quieter pages, those not always taught in classrooms, not carved into marble, but just as real, just as vital. Operation Northwoods was a story not of what happened, but of what almost did. And sometimes, those are the most important stories of all, the ones that remind us how thin the line can be between principle and power, between protection and pretense. It is easy to believe that the past is settled, that its documents have dried, its decisions finalized. But every page left unread still carries weight. Every silence can still speak. And in the quiet uncovering of this plan, its birth, its rejection, its burial and eventual revelation, we are reminded that truth has its own slow rhythm. It waits patiently until the world is ready to listen. We owe something, however quietly, to that truth. We owe it the humility to learn, the patience to understand, and the courage to ask what kind of future we shape when we forget the difficult choices of the past. Not all history ends with monuments. Some ends with a president quietly pushing away a folder, some with an archivist brushing dust from a file 3 decades later, some with a listener, perhaps like you, hearing a story in the stillness of night and remembering it not with fear, but with awareness. If this story has offered anything, let it be a soft reminder that the world we inherit is made not only by those who act, but also by those who stop actions before they begin. That every quiet no in history can echo louder than the loudest declarations. So rest now. You followed the path through shadow and strategy, deception and integrity, risk and restraint. Let your thoughts loosen. Let the world slow. Let the story close, gently. And as you sleep, remember, the truth will always wait, but only those who remain awake will ever find it. Good night.